I was standing in a marble hallway that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner when I realized my mother didn't know who I was. She held a folded towel against her chest like a shield, eyes darting past me waiting for instructions. When I said her name, the name she'd answered to my entire life, she flinched, not with recognition, but with fear. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said softly. "I don't want any trouble, I'm just here to work." That was the moment everything inside me went quiet. Not rage, not tears, something colder, something focused. I stepped into the powder room, shut the door, and called my lawyer. "Open every file," I said. "Tonight I take everything back for my mother." 5 years earlier, I had left this town before dawn, the way people do when they don't want goodbyes to turn into anchors. My assignment had been federal. The kind you don't explain over the phone, the kind where you learn to speak carefully and trust slowly. Logistics, oversight, risk mitigation, words that sound dull until you realize how much damage they prevent when done right. Before I left, I made sure my mother was safe. She had never wanted luxury. She wanted quiet, space, a place where her knees wouldn't ache from climbing stairs and where she could sit in the sun with her morning coffee. I bought the house because I could, and because after everything she'd given up raising me alone, it felt right. A $3.2 million mansion sounds extravagant until you realize it wasn't in Manhattan or Malibu. It was in a quiet, affluent pocket of the Midwest, stone exterior, wide windows, a yard that backed into old oak trees. The kind of house people pass slowly and say, "That must belong to someone important." It did. It belonged to my mother. I put everything in order before I left. Deeds, trusts, a power of attorney that only activated under strict conditions. I hired a property management firm to handle maintenance and checked in when I could, though my calls became shorter then less frequent. Operational security has a way of shrinking your world. Still, I never stopped sending money, never stopped believing that when I came home she'd be waiting with that familiar smile and a list of complaints about the neighbors' hedges. Instead, 5 years later, I returned to find silence. The driveway was full when I arrived, too full. Cars I didn't recognize. A delivery truck, a woman smoking near the side entrance, scrolling her phone. I sat in my rental car longer than necessary, watching the house as if it might explain itself. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the furniture had changed. The walls were the same, but the feeling was wrong. It felt like a hotel pretending to be a home. Voices drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, laughter, clinking glasses. Then I saw her. She was bent over a bucket near the base of the staircase, wringing out a mop. Her hair, once carefully brushed every morning, was pulled back into a thin elastic. She wore gray slacks and a plain white top with a small logo stitched near the collar. She looked smaller. I said her name without thinking. She straightened too quickly, nearly losing her balance, and looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has wandered somewhere they don't belong. "Yes," she asked. I took a step closer. "Mom, it's me." Her brow furrowed. She glanced over her shoulder as if someone else should be handling this conversation. I'm sorry," she said. "Are you with the guests?" Guests. My mother was calling strangers guests in her own home. I asked who she worked for. She hesitated, then gave a name I didn't recognize. A man, apparently. She said he was very particular about cleanliness, that she was supposed to stay out of the way. Every word landed like a quiet accusation. I asked how long she'd been working there. She shrugged. "I don't know, a while." She did not ask who I was. That hurt more than anything else. I excused myself before my composure broke. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection and saw something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: fear. Not for me. For her. For how thoroughly someone had erased the woman who raised me. Later that night, after the house had emptied and my mother had been guided upstairs to a small room that clearly wasn't the master bedroom, I sat alone in the darkened living room. I reviewed public records on my phone, property transfers, medical filings, guardianship notes. Things don't vanish overnight. They are taken inch by inch, paper by paper, signature by signature. I realized then that my absence had been used as a weapon. And I understood something else too. This wasn't just about money, or ownership, or revenge. It was about dignity. And I was done letting anyone take that from my mother. I slept in my car that night. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because I couldn't bring myself to leave the house, not really. I parked across the street, engine off, watching the dark outline of the mansion like it might confess something if I waited long enough. The lights in the upstairs windows flicked off one by one. Somewhere inside, my mother was being told when to sleep, where to sleep, and what time to wake up. I tried to picture her lying down without her usual routines, without her radio murmuring late-night talk shows, without the quiet authority she once carried in every room she entered. Morning came gray and slow. I went back inside just after 6 using the same unlocked door. The house was already awake. Coffee brewed in a machine I didn't recognize. A man in his 40s sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through his tablet feet, propped on a stool that had once belonged to my mother. He glanced up, frowned, and looked away as if I were an inconvenience rather than a question. No one asked who I was. My mother appeared from the hallway carrying a tray toast fruit neatly arranged. She set it down without making eye contact. "Careful," the man said. "You missed a spot yesterday near the stairs." "Yes, sir," she replied automatically. That voice wasn't hers. Not really. It was thinner, flattened. The voice of someone who has learned that arguing only makes things worse. I felt my jaw tighten. I followed her into the laundry room a few minutes later. She startled when she saw me again, hands fluttering at her sides. "I'm not supposed to talk," she said quickly. "If you need something, you should ask." "You don't have to explain," I said gently. "I just want to help." Her eyes searched my face as if there were something familiar hiding there. For a second, hope flared. Then it disappeared. "I'm fine," she said. "They're good to me here." The word echoed. I asked about her doctor. She named someone I didn't know. I asked when she'd last been out of the house. She shrugged again. I asked where her personal things were. She pointed upstairs toward the small room at the end of the hall. When I opened that door, my breath caught. One dresser, half a closet, no photos, no jewelry box, no keepsakes, no evidence of a life lived beyond service. This wasn't neglect. This was control. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to think like I did on assignment, slowly, carefully, without emotion clouding the facts. Cognitive decline doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's often accelerated by isolation medication, mismanagement stress, and a steady erosion of identity. My mother had been stripped of hers piece by piece. That afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the counter recognized the address immediately. "Oh," she said, lowering her voice, "that house." She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. Her eyes did the talking. I requested copies of every filing associated with my mother's name: guardianship petitions, medical proxies, financial authorizations. There were more documents than there should have been. Several signatures didn't match. Dates overlapped in ways that made no sense. A power of attorney had been activated under cognitive incapacity during a period when my mother had still been managing her own accounts. Someone had declared her unfit without ever calling me. On the drive back, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I pulled over once just to breathe. When I returned to the house, the man from the morning was gone. A woman sat in his place sipping wine, though it wasn't even 5 o'clock. She asked if I was new staff. I smiled and said nothing. That evening I watched my mother from a distance. How she waited for instructions. How she apologized for things that weren't mistakes. How she deferred even when she was right. I remembered the woman who taught me to drive stick shift, who negotiated hospital bills like a lawyer, who once marched into a school office and refused to leave until a teacher apologized to me. That woman was still here. She was just buried. Late that night, I sat beside her on the back porch. The air was cool, cicadas humming in the trees. "You don't have to stay up," she told me. "They don't like it when I'm tired in the morning." "They?" I asked softly. She paused. "The people who live here." I swallowed. "Do you feel safe?" I asked. She considered the question carefully, the way you do when you've learned the wrong answer has consequences. "I feel managed," she said finally. That was enough. I stepped away and made another call, this time to a geriatric care specialist I trusted, someone I'd worked with years earlier. I described what I'd seen, what I suspected. Her response was immediate and firm. "This is elder exploitation," she said, "and it doesn't stop unless someone intervenes." I looked back at the house, at the lights glowing warm and false against the dark. "I'm intervening," I said. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt something shift. Not relief. Readiness. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. People expect anger to announce itself. They brace for raised voices, slammed doors, accusations thrown like stones. I gave them none of that. Instead, I listened. I watched. I let the house speak in its own way. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. By the third day, I knew the schedule. Who came and went. Which rooms were locked. Which names were spoken with authority and which were spoken only in whispers. The man I'd seen the first morning, his name was Carl, appeared to be the center of gravity. Others deferred to him. When he wasn't present, the house felt looser, less controlled. Carl arrived every afternoon, always after my mother had finished her work. That alone told me something. I followed him once, keeping a careful distance. He drove to a medical office park on the edge of town, the kind with identical beige buildings and overgrown shrubs. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I already suspected what I'd find. Back at the county records office, I requested medical filings tied to the guardianship petition. It took longer this time, more signatures, more forms, more hesitation from the clerk. "You didn't hear this from me," she said quietly, sliding the folder across the counter, but there were concerns raised. They didn't go anywhere. Concerns about what I asked. She hesitated, then sighed. Medication changes, isolation, financial interest. Financial interest. The words felt clinical, harmless. They weren't. Inside the folder were evaluations that contradicted each other. One doctor described mild cognitive impairment, nothing unusual for someone her age. Another, signed just weeks later, declared her incapable of managing her affairs. The handwriting on that second report was rushed, sloppy. And the doctor retired 2 months after signing. I drove to the address listed on the form anyway. The office was closed, blinds drawn, sign removed. A neighboring business owner told me the practice had shut down suddenly. That afternoon I sat with my mother while she folded linens. I didn't correct her technique. I didn't tell her she didn't need to do this. I just sat. "Do you remember when you bought this house?" I asked gently. She smiled faintly. "It's a nice place," she said. "They let me stay here because I work hard." "That's not what I asked," I said. Her hands slowed. "I don't remember buying it," she admitted. "I don't remember much from before." "Do you remember me?" She looked at me again, longer this time. There was something there, a flicker like a light trying to come back on. "I feel like I should," she said softly, "but my head gets tired when I try." That night I reviewed bank statements. Accounts that had once been straightforward now branched into confusing transfers and shell companies. Payments labeled as care services far exceeded market rates. Someone was being paid handsomely to keep my mother confused and compliant. This wasn't negligence. It was orchestration. I called the geriatric specialist again. We went line by line through the documentation. She confirmed what I already knew. They isolated her, she said. Limited contact, controlled information, adjusted medication. It doesn't take much to make someone doubt themselves, especially when everyone around them agrees they're not well. I stared at the screen at my mother's name stamped across documents she would never have understood. "Can it be reversed?" I asked. There was a pause. Some of it she said carefully, but not without removing her from the environment causing the harm. That was the moment I stopped thinking about exposure and started thinking about extraction. The next day I met with a local attorney recommended by my lawyer, someone who had handled elder abuse cases quietly, effectively. He reviewed the files without comment, his expression tightening as he read. "This is sophisticated," he said finally. "Not brilliant, but practiced. Whoever did this has done it before." "Can we prove intent?" I asked. He nodded slowly, with time and patience. I had both. Before I left his office, he asked one more question. "Why didn't you notice sooner?" "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact." "I trusted the systems I put in place," I said, "and I was gone." He nodded. "That's usually enough." That evening I sat with my mother again. She asked if I was visiting for long. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. She smiled, uncertain but comforted. As I watched her fold the same towel 3 times, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not guilt. Responsibility. Silence had allowed this to happen. Distance had made it possible. And now that I knew the truth beneath it all, there was no unknowing it. I sent one final message to my lawyer before bed. I wrote, "I have confirmation. Proceed." And somewhere deep inside that quiet house, the balance began to shift. I made the call at exactly 6:42 a.m. Not because that time carried meaning, but because the house was quiet then. Control thrives in noise. Truth prefers stillness. I sat in my car at the edge of the driveway, phone resting against my ear, watching the sun rise behind the oak trees. The mansion looked peaceful in that early light, innocent even. That's how these things always look from the outside. My lawyer answered on the second ring. "I'm ready," I said. He didn't ask what I meant, he already knew. "Walk me through it," he said. I did. Calmly. Methodically. I described the documents, the overlapping dates, the retired physician, the shell companies, the medication discrepancies. I told him about my mother's living conditions, her confusion, her obedience, the way she asked permission to rest. There was a long silence when I finished. "This crosses state and federal thresholds," he said finally. "Elder exploitation, financial fraud, potential medical abuse." "Good," I replied. "Then we're aligned." I could hear papers shuffling on his end. The sound was grounding, real. "I'll need authorization to initiate emergency injunctions," he said. "Asset freezes, a temporary restraining order. We'll also request an independent cognitive evaluation." "Do it," I said. "Open every file." He hesitated, not legally but humanly. "This will get messy," he warned. "People who benefit from this don't go quietly." "I'm not asking for quiet," I said. "I'm asking for correct." That earned a low chuckle. "All right," he said. "Tonight then." When I ended the call, I didn't move right away. I let the weight of the decision settle. Once you cross a line like this, there's no pretending you're just visiting. You're not a guest anymore. You're an intervening force. Inside the house, the day began as usual. Carl arrived, late morning irritation already etched into his posture. He barely acknowledged me. "You're still here," he said flatly. "Yes," I replied. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "This is a private residence." "So is the county courthouse," I said. "But that didn't stop you." His eyes narrowed. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to my mother, handing her a list of tasks like a supervisor might hand out uniforms. I watched her take the paper with both hands. That was the moment I stopped protecting appearances. "I'm taking her to lunch," I said. Carl laughed, once sharp and dismissive. "She has responsibilities." "She has rights," I said, "and so do I." He stepped closer. "You don't have authority here." I met his gaze. That's about to change. He scoffed, but I saw it then, the flicker of uncertainty. Predators rely on certainty. Doubt is corrosive. I took my mother's hand gently. She stiffened at first, then relaxed. "It's okay," I told her. "You're not in trouble." She nodded, though I wasn't sure she understood. At the restaurant, she barely ate. The menu overwhelmed her. Too many choices, too many words. I ordered for both of us, choosing things she used to like. Halfway through the meal, she looked up at me. "You're very kind," she said. "You remind me of someone." I swallowed. "Who?" She tilted her head. "My daughter. She was capable." That word landed harder than any accusation. That afternoon, the legal machinery began to move. Notifications were sent, accounts flagged. A judge signed off on a temporary freeze pending review. A social worker was scheduled to visit within 48 hours. Carl didn't know yet. But the house felt it. People grew cautious. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Doors closed more often. My mother was told to stay upstairs to rest. I documented everything. Dates, times, statements, small details that would matter later. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into an uneasy quiet, my lawyer called back. "It's in motion," he said. "They're scrambling." "Good," I said. "There's one more thing," he added. "Once this becomes public record, some people will claim they were acting in her best interest." I looked through the window at my mother, seated alone, folding the same towel again and again. "Intent doesn't erase impact," I said. "And ignorance isn't innocence." When the call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. This wasn't revenge, not the kind people imagine. This was correction. And it had already begun. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. They came quietly, the way real accountability usually does. It started with a knock on the door just after noon the next day. Two people stood on the front step, a county social worker and a uniformed deputy who remained respectfully in the background. Carl answered, irritation flashing across his face before he smoothed it into a practiced smile. I stayed where I was seated at the dining table, my mother beside me. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers worrying the edge of a napkin. "We're here for a welfare check," the social worker said, "regarding the resident Mrs. Harris." Carl glanced at me, just a flicker, just enough. "She's resting," he said. "She's had a difficult—" "She's right here," I interrupted calmly. The social worker turned toward us. Her expression shifted the moment she saw my mother, how she sat, how she waited, how she looked to Carl before answering even the simplest question. That was all the confirmation she needed. The visit lasted less than 30 minutes, long enough to ask questions, long enough to observe dynamics, long enough to note inconsistencies. When they left, Carl's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jump. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly once the door closed. "No," I replied. I corrected one. By that evening, the first official notices arrived. Account freezes, requests for documentation, formal demands for explanation. The tone was polite, unyielding, impossible to ignore. Carl didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He tried something subtler. He sat across from me in the living room, legs crossed, hands folded, like a man negotiating a business deal rather than defending his freedom. "She was declining when we stepped in," he said. "You weren't here. Someone had to manage things." "You managed them very well," I said, "for yourself." He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand how expensive care is. The house, the staff, the medical oversight." "She was scrubbing floors," I said. "That's not care." The word landed. He flinched despite himself. Over the next week, the story unraveled piece by piece. The doctor who'd signed the incapacitation report had been recommended by Carl. The pharmacy filling my mother's prescriptions had followed instructions that didn't align with standard geriatric care. The shell companies receiving payments traced back to a trust Carl controlled indirectly. Each discovery was documented, logged, cross-referenced. There were meetings, closed-door conversations, lawyers speaking in careful phrases that tried to soften hard truths. One afternoon, Carl asked to speak to me alone. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. I studied him, really looked. People like him don't wake up intending to destroy someone's life. They justify, they rationalize. They tell themselves stories until those stories become permissions. "You didn't mean for it to stop," I replied. He had no answer for that. The legal outcomes were measured, not theatrical. Funds were seized pending investigation. The guardianship petition was overturned. Professional licenses came under review. Criminal charges were discussed, then narrowed, then formalized. My mother was moved to a private care facility temporarily, not because she needed confinement, but because she needed space to stabilize. Independent doctors adjusted her medications, reduced them, monitored her responses. The changes were small at first. She slept more peacefully. She stopped apologizing when she spoke. She began asking questions. One afternoon, she reached for my hand without prompting. "I know you," she said suddenly. My breath caught. "You do?" She nodded. You're my girl." It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was real. That night, I sat alone in the now quiet house. The furniture looked like props without people to animate them. I thought about how easily power hides behind paperwork, how often silence is mistaken for consent. Revenge would have been loud, it would have satisfied something sharp and immediate. This didn't feel like revenge. It felt like restoration. When the final notice arrived, confirming full return of ownership and control, I didn't celebrate. I forwarded it to my lawyer and shut my laptop. The cost of what had been taken couldn't be calculated in dollars. But at least now no one was pretending nothing had happened. And that mattered. Recovery didn't look the way I had imagined it. There was no sudden clarity, no cinematic moment where my mother sat up straight and said my name like she used to. Healing came in fragments, uneven, quiet, and often humbling. The facility we chose was modest by design. No grand chandeliers, no marble floors, just clean rooms, large windows, and staff who spoke slowly and listened fully. The kind of place where time was treated as a resource, not a liability. The first week, my mother asked the same questions repeatedly. Am I allowed to sit here? Do I need to clean this? Will someone be upset if I rest? Each time I answered calmly. Each time I reminded her she was safe. I stayed nearby in a rented apartment across town. I visited every morning and most evenings. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we sat in silence. I learned not to fill the quiet. Silence had been used against her for too long. Now it was hers again. One afternoon as we worked on a simple puzzle together, she paused and looked at me with sudden intensity. "You didn't leave me, did you?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "No," I said softly, "I never left you." She nodded, satisfied, as if confirming something she'd suspected all along. That night I cried for the first time since returning home. Not from anger, from grief. Grief for the years she'd lost, for the woman she'd been forced to become in order to survive, for my own absence, justified though it had been. The legal proceedings continued in the background, quieter now, but no less serious. I attended meetings when necessary, signed documents, answered questions. Carl's name surfaced less frequently. When it did, it was in the past tense. One day a letter arrived addressed to me. Not from a lawyer, from Carl. I didn't open it right away. When I finally did, it wasn't an apology. Not really. It was an explanation, a justification framed as regret. He wrote about financial pressure, about how temporary measures became permanent, about how my mother seemed easier when she stopped questioning things. I folded the letter and set it aside. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, but it's closer than hatred. As my mother stabilized, small parts of her old self began to surface. She corrected a nurse gently when she mixed up dates. She laughed at a joke on the radio. She asked for her favorite tea without prompting. One morning as we walked in the garden, she stopped and looked at me. "You've always been stubborn," she said. I smiled. "You taught me that." She smiled back, uncertain but warm. That was enough. I decided not to sell the house. Not yet. Instead, I renovated it, not to restore its grandeur but its purpose. I removed excess furniture, opened the windows, returned her photographs to the walls. I turned the small upstairs room back into a guest room and reclaimed the master bedroom as hers, even though she wasn't ready to move back yet. It mattered that the space remembered who it belonged to. When she finally visited the house again weeks later, she stood in the doorway and took a long breath. "This feels familiar," she said. "It should," I replied. "It's yours." She didn't ask how, she didn't ask why. She trusted me. That trust felt heavier than any responsibility I'd ever carried. As weeks turned into months, the anger I'd been holding onto began to loosen its grip. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped imagining alternate endings. I focused instead on what was in front of me, a mother relearning how to exist without permission. Reconciliation, I learned, isn't about restoring the past. It's about choosing what comes next. I didn't seek revenge beyond the boundaries of the law. I didn't need to. Accountability had done its work, quietly, permanently. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset from the back porch of the facility, my mother leaned her head against my shoulder. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I answered. And for the first time since all of this began, I believed it. The quiet after everything is what surprised me most. Not the silence of an empty house or the absence of phone calls from lawyers, those I expected. What I didn't expect was the way life settles when the noise of wrongdoing finally stops. It doesn't rush to fill the space. It asks you to listen. My mother moved back into the house in early spring. Not all at once, not triumphantly. We took it slow, first afternoons, then a night or two. Then eventually the comfort of routine returned, breakfast at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the floors, her favorite chair facing the window. She still had moments of confusion. Names slipped away sometimes, dates tangled. But she was herself again in the ways that mattered. She made choices. She asked questions. She disagreed. Once, when I suggested rearranging the living room, she looked at me and said, "Absolutely not." I laughed harder than I had in years. The legal cases closed one by one. Some outcomes were public, others were sealed. Accountability rarely looks like a headline. Most of the time it looks like records corrected, privileges revoked, and people quietly removed from positions they should never have held. That was enough for me. I never wanted punishment for the sake of punishment. I wanted safety, truth, balance. And I wanted my mother's voice back. One afternoon, as we sorted through old photographs, she picked up a picture of me as a child, hair in uneven braids, knees scraped, smiling without reservation. "You were fearless," she said. "I was protected," I replied. She considered that, then nodded. Later I realized how much of this story wasn't about what had been taken, but about what had been assumed. We assume systems will protect the vulnerable. We assume paperwork equals permission. We assume silence means consent. Most of all, we assume time will wait. It doesn't. If there is one thing I wish I had done differently, it's this: I would have stayed more connected, asked harder questions sooner, checked in more often even when life made it inconvenient. Distance creates opportunity not just for growth but for harm. My mother and I talked about that one evening as we sat on the porch, the air cool and forgiving. "I didn't want to bother you," she said. "You never bother me," I answered. She smiled, then grew serious. "I thought being quiet would make things easier." That belief cost her dearly. It costs a lot of people dearly. We don't talk enough about how easily older adults can be pushed aside, not with cruelty, but with politeness. Not with force, but with forms. How a person can lose control of their life while everyone insists it's for their own good. I share this story not to dwell on what went wrong, but to remind you of what still can go right. Ask questions, read what you sign, stay connected, trust, but verify. And if something feels off, listen to that feeling. It's often the only warning you'll get. My mother is doing well now. Not perfect, not restored to who she was 20 years ago, but present, dignified, heard. That matters more than any house, any account, any victory. As for me, I've learned that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly gathering facts, making calls at dawn, and choosing patience over spectacle. Revenge is loud. Justice is steady. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love or a conversation you've been putting off, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on that. Maybe even act on it. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a thought or a memory in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about accountability, resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to do what's right, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for staying until the end.